Wonderful. I'm excited to be with you all here today to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years to try to understand how costly our brain activity patterns are. But before I explain what we mean by cost, I want to highlight one of the problem spaces that led us into this area of research. So as you know, as you move throughout your daily life, as you go to classes, as you talk to your friends or your family, your brain is constantly changing its activity pattern. As you respond to the world, as you think introspectively, in each case, the activity patterns are going to change. And as your brain changes its activity patterns, that requires energy. We're interested in how much energy is required. We're also interested in whether there are specific kinds of activities that require more energy than others. So for example, if you're talking to your friends, does that require more energy or less energy than doing some math problems, for example? Or if you do something that you've done really frequently before, does that take more energy or less energy than something that you've done for the first time? So in order to answer some of these questions, we have to dig down into how our brain is organized and where the energy is arising from. So how do we think about quantifying the cost of a pattern of brain activity? If the brain was composed of independent pieces, like little units or cells that are completely separate from one another, then we could calculate the amount of energy that's required for a particular activation pattern by just summing up the amount of energy that was required to activate each piece. So we just say, oh, these pieces are activated this amount, we'll just sum it up, that's the energy that's required. But there's a big problem in that that's not actually how the brain is organized. The brain is not composed of independent pieces. As you can see from the image above, the brain is a volume. It's a volume of tissue. Yes, it's composed of cells, but those cells are interconnected with one another. So there's a complexity in the material constituents that requires us to think a little bit differently about how to calculate energy. So let's think a little bit more about how the brain is organized in a way that's going to help us quantify energy here. So what I'm showing you here is a picture of the cortex, and at the top what you're seeing is what's called gray matter, that's this darker area, and then underneath is what's called white matter, and that's what's white in the picture. That external dark gray matter ribbon is composed of neuronal cell bodies. So that's where a lot of the calculations are happening, is in those cell bodies. And then the white bit, the white matter, that is composed of neuronal axons. So that's kind of the arm or the transmission highway whereby the neuron can calculate something and then send that information on to another cell. So this little zoom panel here shows you that the cell bodies, these dark pieces here, are located in the gray matter, and then their axons are located in the white matter. So that changes how we think about modeling the system and quantifying the cost of activating any particular piece. Now that's an image of, from a cartoon, from a schematic, somebody drew it. This is an image of an actual real person's brain and the pattern of white matter connections between different areas. So this is an image that is acquired from what's called diffusion spectrum imaging, which is a type of imaging technique that is available using an MRI machine. You can use the ones that are in local hospitals, but you can also use research grade ones that are typically using a 3 Tesla magnet or possibly a 7 Tesla magnet to acquire these kinds of images. What's really important to understand about this pattern is that it's not perfectly regular. This is not a lattice-like organization of connectivity. It's also not perfectly random. There's some structure in here, but there's also a lot of variation. A second thing that's important to note about this image is that this is one person, and this pattern of connectivity is different for every single one of us. So that also means that how activity can flow through our brains is different for each of us. Okay, so that means that when I'm wondering how we can calculate how much energy is required or how costly it is to activate a pattern in the brain, what I really want to do is understand, as the human each of us is experiencing the world, and it's moving through a pattern of activity, as I'm showing you here, that is happening on top of this structural white matter connectivity. It's happening on top of fixed routes. These are routes that aren't changing, at least in the typical adulthood. It changes over development, changes over late age, but these patterns don't actually change significantly in adulthood. So how do we have multiple patterns of activity that are occurring in response to the world, but those are orchestrated on an underlying fixed set of highways? Okay, so that's the problem that I want to address in the next couple of minutes. So I'm going to separate my remarks into 3 sections. In the first one, what I want to do is to build some intuition around this problem and propose a formal account of it. In the second one, I want to use that account to understand costly activity brain patterns in humans. And then in the third section, I want to extend the account to examine the cost of neural computation, because I think this approach has something to tell us about how we think about computation. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Let's build a little bit of intuition around why the underlying structure of the network constrains how we can think about energetic requirements. All right, so in order to do that, I want to use 2 pieces of imagery. At the top here, what I'm showing you is a pattern of activity where every box is the activation profile of one of the nodes in the network. So underneath is a network that corresponds to this activity state. I'm going to call this a state and this the network. So what this indicates is that the first 3 units here are relatively active. They have a darker color. The next 3 units are relatively not active. They have a lighter color. And then the last 4 units are pretty active. And I'm indicating that by the darker color. Okay, so by thinking about these pairs of the activity state and the underlying network, we can start to understand that certain states are easy for certain networks to achieve, and other states are quite difficult for a given network to achieve. So I want you to focus your attention on the top of this slide first. You have a state where the first 5 units are active, so they're darker. The second 5 units are less active, so they're lighter. And what I want to do is to maintain or hold that state on a network that looks like this. So there's one interconnected module on one side, another module on the other side, and only one connection in between them. This state is relatively easy for this network because the state itself aligns with the network structure. You can activate the first module and all 5 units will be active. You can inhibit this module and these ones will remain not very active. And the activity won't bleed across very much because there's only one weak connection between them, right? Now let's contrast that with the image at the bottom of the slide, where we have the same activity state, so activation of the first 5 units and deactivation of the second 5 units, but that's happening on top of a very different network. So this network has those 2 modules, but they're densely interconnected with one another. For this network to achieve this state is actually quite difficult, because as soon as you activate the first module, it's sharing all of that activity into the second module. And as soon as you inhibit this module, that inhibitory signal can also flow into the other module. So the topology of the network, the structure of the network, is something that makes it difficult for this system to reach and maintain that state. Now, one more piece of intuition is that this also impacts how easy it is for a system to move between 2 different states. So let's focus here on a relatively easy transition. On the left-hand side, you see activation of the first 5 units and deactivation of the second on top of that modular network. We already talked about how the topology of the network supports this activation profile. And then if we want to switch it so that all of the originally active units are off, and then all of the originally inactive units are on, we need to inject an inhibitory signal into the first module and an excitatory signal into the second module. Okay, so that's relatively easy. There are 2 control inputs that we needed to use. But let's try this one, where the initial activity profile is one where the first unit is off, the next one's on, The next one's off, and then on, and off, and on. That's sitting on top of this modular network. First of all, it's really difficult for us to even have attained this state because there's nothing about the topology that's helping us. We actually have to fight against the topology consistently in order to reach this state. And then if we want to transition into this alternative state where anything that was on initially is now off and anything that was off initially is now on, we need to inject an excitatory or inhibitory signal into every single node in the network to swap them. Right? Again, we can't use anything about the underlying network to help us because the network topology is not aligned with the structure of the state. So when I'm saying easy or difficult here, you may be inferring that what I mean is something about the number of control signals I need to inject, potentially the complexity of the control signals, maybe their time dynamics, maybe their spatial extent. So what I'd like to do is to understand how to quantify this ease versus difficulty in terms of the control inputs required to have a network attain or transition between certain states. That is a problem that has been really nicely solved by what's called network control theory, which is an area of engineering broadly that has been utilized to understand and engage with systems like the power grid, mechanical systems, air traffic control systems, and robotic systems. And in those cases, what is important is trying to understand how the underlying network structure of these systems determines which state transitions are easy versus hard, meaning those that require less or more complex control inputs. Some of the questions that are asked in this field are, for a given network, which of the transitions are easy? And which ones are more difficult? Or for a given network, which control inputs are needed in order to achieve a desired state transition? So as an illustration of the way these kinds of problems are formulated, here's a network where there are 4 nodes and 4 edges. So X are the nodes, A are the edges. And the inputs, U1 and U2, can be time varying, and they're injected into particular nodes. So into X1, for example, and then into X2. What happens when you inject those U1s and U2s is that the state of the system can move from wherever it was initially, let's say at the origin where nothing was active, to some final desired state where there's a different level of activity across each of the nodes. It's an interesting question about what are the desired states for your particular system. That depends on the system. And then the next question is, well, how can I derive the U's that are going to enable me to get the system from here to there? Okay, if we're going to try to apply network control theory to a brain, then the first thing that we need to do is to write down some kind of model for how the activity flows on the network. Here's the simplest model I think that you could probably write down, and in the next slide we'll expand that to something more complicated. But in this case, what I'm writing down is that the state of the brain at time t plus 1 is going to be equal to the state of the brain at time t, and then this is the adjacency matrix that is encoding the pattern of connectivity between brain regions. So that's the white matter that I showed you earlier. And if it was just these 2 pieces, that would just mean that wherever the activity is now, it can flow along the white matter connections to determine where the activity is next, right? But now we have this other term here at the end, which changes what can happen. So this is where the control input is being injected. So U sub kappa is the input that can be time varying. It's injected into kappa regions. And B sub kappa is a matrix, typically with 1s along the diagonal indicating where the inputs can be injected. So maybe for one of your systems that you're interested in, you can inject input only into nodes 1 and 2, but nodes 3 and following are not accessible to you. This is actually true in the case of brain stimulation. particularly with transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is where there's a magnetic wand that is used to change the activity locally of a particular brain region that can really only target areas that are on the surface of the brain and not, it can't reach into the center of the brain. So there are only some regions that are actually accessible to input. And that's something that you would encode in choosing what kappas are. Now, so what this indicates, as we put it all together, is that where activity is right now can flow along the white matter tracks and be modulated by other input, and that together those two pieces determine where the brain goes next. Now, in order to quantify which transitions are easy versus difficult, we can calculate the energy required for that transition. And we define the energy here as a simple function of the inputs u. This entire model, as I said, is probably the simplest one that you could write down. It's linear, it's time invariant, it's noise-free. There's lots of things that are very simple about it, right? However, what's interesting about it is that it is something that has been validated by some work from a recent postdoc in my laboratory that was published in 2023, validated as a relatively good model for large-scale neuroimaging data in humans. So, for example, fMRI data. And that's because of the temporal averaging, the noise, and the spatial averaging that occurs in those signals. But you can also expand beyond that simple model to something that's a little bit more complicated. So here I'm showing you 3 different classes of models that vary in complexity. We can start with the linear time invariant models. The only thing that's different here from what I showed you in the previous slide is that we may not have access to measuring x. Maybe we can measure y instead, and so we can write down a model y, or a variable y that is measurable, that is a function of x. What's nice about this model is that it's simple. There's extensive machinery that has been developed, particularly in the context of network control theory, and it's also a first approximation for nonlinear dynamics. So if you have a dynamical system that's sitting in the vicinity of an operating point, then you can use this linear approximation while it's moving around that operating point. But we can also expand to use more complex models like this one. This one we would call a linear time varying model. What you can see is different is that the A matrix, the pattern of connectivity, is changing with time. That can happen in a variety of different scenarios, definitely over development as the pattern of connectivity in your brain is changing, but it can happen in other contexts too. And then B is also changing. So B is also a function of time, which means that control inputs could be injected to different regions as a function of time. And then finally, we can have nonlinear models, fully nonlinear models that can be really helpful, particularly, I think, when we want to specify the fact that there are certain sectors of the state space that we never see the brain go to. The first 2 kinds of models allow the brain to go to any state, but we know that the brain never is in a state where everything is off. That doesn't happen. We also know that the brain is never in a state where everything is fully on, so maximum activity. Neither of those states does the brain go to. And also states around those are not typically visited either. Okay, so where would we use these more complex models? One is when we're studying epilepsy, we have used the linear time varying model. And the reason we do that is that when the brain is moving from the beginning of the seizure to the middle of the seizure to the end of the seizure, there's a different set of connections that are being effectively employed. So we can extract the effective connections in those different regimes of the seizure and use a time varying A matrix in our control model. But we've also used fully nonlinear versions as well to study network control, and that's particularly in the context of oscillator networks, and that's work that was led by Tomas Manara. And finally, we've also done a some work in data-driven control, which is useful if you can't write down the model for the dynamics of your system and you just don't know what the model should be. There are ways of still learning control strategies when the model is not accessible. Okay, that brings me to section 2. Where now that we have built a little bit of an intuition using those schematics and proposed the formal account, specifically network control theory, what I'd like to do is to use that account to try to understand some of the energetics of existing brain activity patterns in humans. So how would we start to do that? Well, one method that we found to be particularly helpful is calculating the energy that would be required for the brain to move from some initial state to some final state. So let's say the initial state here is activation of this strip, which is motor cortex, and we're interested in how it could transition to another state where the activity is localized to the visual system, for example. That's shown in purple here. If we want to understand this particular trajectory, what we can do is use what's called minimum energy control, or also optimal energy control. Those are slightly different but related, where we would design a control input U to minimize the control energy and potentially other factors to drive the desired response. So in most of the studies that my lab and others have done in this space, we construct a minimization problem that has 2 factors in it. The first factor is a factor of distance, and that's what I'm showing here. So you can see that we want to minimize the distance between the current state x and the final state xt. If we're trying to minimize that distance, what does that help us do? That helps us to ensure that the trajectory is relatively smooth and straight toward where we want the system to go, rather than moving in these drastic trajectories throughout the state space. The second factor that we minimize is what I'm showing you here. So we're minimizing the amount of energy that is required for this transition. So in essence, what we'd like to do is to be able to say, how could the brain move from here to here if it's trying to move as straight as possible and with the least amount of energy expenditure? Why would we want to make the trajectory as straight as possible and minimize energy expenditure? That's motivated by biological factors. So specifically, time efficiency is going to drive a trajectory that's relatively straight toward a goal. And energetic efficiency is going to motivate a minimization of the energy necessary to enact a particular state transition. Now, you could say, and we definitely did, say, well, but this is a theoretical notion of energy. Is this just a mathematical construct, or does it have biophysical relevance as well? So in work that was led by Xiaosong He, who was a postdoc in my laboratory and published in 2022, he showed that the amount of energy that is predicted to be required for a state transition is directly correlated with glucose metabolism. So connecting our theoretical notion of energy to a biophysical notion of energy. There's still a lot of work left to do in this area, but it's some initial evidence that there is potentially a biological underpinning for this energetic cost that I'm describing to you. Okay, so with this approach, let's ask some very simple questions about how the brain moves through states. The first question that I want to ask is how much energy is needed for the brain to rest? So just to sort of stay in the activity profile that's its default state, the activity profile that you would see if you just had people lying in a scanner, not thinking about anything in particular. Okay, so this is how much energy is just required for that baseline default state. To answer that question, what we did is that we started the brain from a set of random states chosen throughout the state space and asked, what is the target state that we could move to that would require the least energy? So from wherever you begin in the large state space, what's the target state that would require the least energy to go towards? And the probability of a region being located in that target state is here along the y-axis, and then along the x-axis is the log of the strength of that node, meaning the number and strength of connections coming out of it. So for those regions that are really highly connected, those are over here on the right-hand side. For those areas that are really highly connected, they tend to be located in the low energy target state. Those are also the regions that are active when we're just resting inside of a scanner. So what's interesting about that is that it suggests that the brain sits at rest in a place that is a relatively low energy place. Also, it means that that activity profile that it sits in at rest is aligned with the structure. Remember, I was saying earlier that when your state is aligned with the structure or aligned with the network, it requires less energy to reach and to maintain. That's exactly what we see in the actual brain, which is that the state that the brain sits in at rest is the one aligned with structure and requiring least energy to go toward. But we don't rest all the time. We have jobs, we have an education maybe that we're pursuing, we have social relationships we're trying to build, we have lots of things we want to do other than rest, right? So what happens when the brain has to do something that's not just resting? To answer that question, Leon Weniger was a graduate student with me, and he said, well, I'm really curious about separating out the very rare states that the brain moves into and the more common states that the brain moves into. So if we have people lying inside of a scanner and we acquire images of their brain every quarter of a second, for example, we will see many states that they go through that are really, really common, hundreds of states. And then every now and then, we'll see a state that we rarely ever see. So in order to quantify the rareness or the commonness of the state, he used the Shannon entropy, suggesting that those rare states that the brain moves to have high information content for us to understand. What he also found is that as the brain moves into those rare states, they require much more energy and hence are misaligned with the structure. So that's what you're seeing here. Along the y-axis here is the control energy required to reach a state. And then along the x-axis is the information content of a state, with the rare states being over here at the far side of the x-axis and the common states being over here at the left side of the x-axis. So this positive relationship means that those states that the brain commonly sits in more regularly, more frequently, require very little energy to reach, whereas those states that are rare, that are visited infrequently, require a lot of energy to reach. And this is true across a variety of different task conditions that participants were engaging in. So they would be potentially engaged in emotion processing, in a gambling task, in a language processing task, a motor task, relational learning, social processing, and working memory. And across all of these, what we observe is this relationship whereby the rare states are those that require more energy to go towards or are more misaligned with the underlying structure of the network. Okay, so we know that the resting state, default state, is relatively low energy, and that sometimes we move into rarer states that require more energy. What happens if we have to perform an explicitly difficult task, and we want to compare the amount of energy that's required for the simpler task and the more difficult task? This is a question that Urs Braun asked when he was a visiting fellow in my laboratory. And what he did was that he compared two tasks that are commonly used in psychology and psychiatry. And they are called the zero-back task and the two-back task. The zero-back task is when you see a stimulus on the screen in front of you, and you just respond to say what that stimulus is. So if there's an A on the screen, you say, I see an A. If there's a B on the screen, you say, I see a B, etc. The two-back task is more complicated. That's where you have to report the stimulus that you saw 2 stimuli ago. So if you saw an A 2 times ago, you have to say A and ignore the fact that there's a C on the screen right now, right? Okay. You can also perform what's called a 3-back task, a 4-back, 5-back, 6-back, 7-back, and you can train yourself to get better and better at this to remember, 7 moments ago, for example. So these are the 2 different tasks. One's just saying what's on the screen, and the other one is remembering what occurred 2 moments ago. Okay, so what Erdős wanted to know was, well, how much energy is required to transition between the simpler task to the more difficult task, and vice versa? And also, how much energy would it take to sit in either of these states? So what I want you to focus on first is the image here on the left-hand side of the slide. So along the y-axis here is the control energy that is required, and then along the x-axis is the transition that we're studying. So this is as we move from the 0-back task to the 2-back task. That means from less complicated to more complicated. And then 2 to 0 means moving from the more difficult task to the less difficult task. So what you can observe is that as you transition into the more cognitively demanding task, that requires more energy, and as you transition into the less cognitively demanding task, that requires less energy. That also means that as we're moving into the more cognitively demanding task, that's pulling the activity away from the structure. Now on the right-hand side, what I'm showing you is what we're calling the stability, which is simply the inverse of the control energy to persist in a state. So when you're performing any of these tasks, or when you're performing a task that requires attention, or maybe you're doing math problems for a certain period of time, you have to maintain a particular activation profile for a duration. It's not just I'm going to touch that state and run away. I have to hold on to it for some period of time. So here what you're seeing is that the amount of energy that is required to stay in the 0-back task is less than the amount of energy that's required to stay in the 2-back task. So the stability of that simpler task is higher, and the stability of the more difficult task is lower. We also observed that each dot here is a separate person inside of the experiment. And what we observed is that there's a lot of variation across people. Some people require more energy to reach the more difficult state, and other people require less energy to reach the more difficult state. We observed that individual differences here in the amount of energy required was correlated with their performance on the task. So for people that required less energy to maintain that difficult state, they also performed better. The third part of this study that Erdős wanted to investigate was what happens in a group of individuals for whom this particular kind of task is especially difficult. So the 2-back task is something that's difficult for people with a variety of different mental health conditions, including psychiatric conditions and neurological disorders. And one really prime example is schizophrenia. So what Erdős wanted to do was to say, let's look at people who have schizophrenia and ask whether they require more energy to perform this task, therefore providing an explanation for why their performance is lower. So that's what I'm showing you here. Along the y-axis is the control energy required to move from the easier to the more difficult task. And in the lighter blue are the healthy individuals, healthy volunteers, and in the darker blue are the people with schizophrenia. So what you can observe is that the participants with schizophrenia required more energy to reach that cognitively more demanding state, consistent with the fact that their performance was also lower consistently. So how we can think about that in terms of images is that the healthy individuals are moving into this transition that has a smaller energy barrier. That's a smaller hill they have to climb. And then as people with schizophrenia are trying to climb that same hill, it's higher. They need to go further in order to perform the 2-back working memory task. Okay, but so far you might feel like this is a little well, it's challenging to think about how we would ever then do anything complicated if it requires a lot of energy for us to move into these rare and more cognitively demanding states. But we do have some evidence to suggest that even though these difficult states are costly, their cost does go down as we engage in long-term learning or habit formation. And so that's really useful news because it means that there can be a change in the underlying energy landscape that allows some of these more difficult states to be more easily reachable with time and with dedicated training. This is a study of macaque monkeys. It was actually just published yesterday, so that's exciting. And what they were doing was the monkeys were learning a habit of examining a range of different objects in order for them to find the one that would have a food reward. And what we found is that the control energy that was required for them to activate this pattern of activity in their search decreased over their learning sessions. And we also found that the control energy required for these habit-forming states decreased as the habits became more and more the same. So this x-axis here is the average similarity factor in their behavior. So the more they performed the exact same thing over and over and over again, so demonstrating that they had really created a habit, the energy required for those transitions decreased. So that suggests to us that when we are learning and when we are engaging in adaptive behavior, the energy required for these more cognitively demanding tasks can decrease, so thereby changing the structure of the energetic landscape. Okay, so the take home here from these studies is that our movement through brain states is dependent upon the underlying network structure and an energy landscape that can be modulated by learning and adaptation. So with that, I want to briefly mention an extension of these ideas that help us to think differently about neural computation, and then we'll close. So both biological and artificial intelligence are thought to depend upon computation. And what we do in this area is to study how both real and fabricated neural systems compute to produce intelligence. But how does computation happen? Well, we can use network control theory to think in a differently formal way about what a computation is. So here what you observe is that we're interested in how we would move a network system from some initial state of activity to another state of activity using some operator that would be a computing operator. So let's frame this computation as a control problem and then use it to study the input that's required for two simple computations. Our goal is to quantify the input needed to drive a particular computation on a network, and then also use this to compare which networks are better suited for which operation. This is work that's currently led by my student Suman Kulkarni and is in preparation. So this is just newer things that I think are exciting to share with you at the moment. So here what you see is an example of a computation that's a simple superposition. So here we have an initial state, x naught, and what we're interested in is adding or superimposing q, so that the final state is going to be the original x naught plus q. The minimum energy input that is required to incorporate that Q into the network is actually simply a function of the eigenvalues of the adjacency matrix A. So if that vector Q projects largely onto the persistent and slowly decaying modes of the network, then it can be incorporated with less energy. Let me give you an example of that pictorially. So here let's focus on a hub and spoke network where node 1 is in the center here, node 2 is at the top, and then 3, 4, and 5. The initial state is shown here. It's relatively positive. And what we'd like to do is to superimpose Q, which is increasing the positivity of the first node and adding a little bit to the rest of the nodes as well, such that the final state looks like this. And we want to contrast that with a different superposition where the Q is increasing the activation state of node 1, but decreasing the activation states of 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, you might think about which you think is going to be more energetically costly, depending on which is projecting onto the network's persistent modes. So here what you see is the minimum energy that is required for this superposition. So on the left-hand side, the one where you're activating node 1 and everything else requires less energy than this one, Q2, where you're activating node 1 but trying to decrease the activity of the other 4 nodes. And the reason is that once you inject energy into node 1, that's going to naturally flow along those edges coming out and increase the activity of everything else as well. So the one on the left-hand side is aligned with the persistent mode of the system. The one on the right-hand side is aligned with a fast decaying mode. Let's use this same kind of reasoning, but think about something that's a little bit more complex than superposition, and that is rotation. This is motivated too by the fruit fly, which has this amazing part of its central nervous system called the central complex, which actually has a bump of activity that moves around a circle that tells the fruit fly where its head direction is. And that helps it if it's blown off course or is navigating. This is kind of the navigational circuit that tells it the direction of its head orientation. So let's think about modeling that like this, where there's a particular bump of activity around a few nodes, let's say activity mostly along this red one, and then a little bit along these 2 yellow ones. So the operation that we're interested in is r hat, that's a rotation by n nodes. So we want to move the bump from here to here. And here's an example of what that rotation matrix could look like. The basis of these are the Fourier modes, and in this basis, the operator acts as a simple phase shift on each mode. What that means is that as we're moving from having the bump here, indicating head orientation in this direction, to a bump over here, meaning head orientation in this direction, if we express that original state in the Fourier basis, then we can write down the minimum energy required for that rotation, and that's dependent on y, again, related to the eigenvalues of the adjacency matrix, but it's also related to w, which is the controllability Gramian. That enables us to see then why certain network structures are going to be differently supportive of the rotation computation. So here we characterize 4 different networks: a ring network that you're seeing on the left-hand side, a rewired ring network, an Erdős-Rényi network, and a grid network. And if we calculate the energy required to rotate the bump, we require less energy if we're working on the ring, a little bit more energy if we're working on the rewired ring, the most energy if we're working on an Erdős-Rényi graph, and also pretty high energy if we're working on a grid. So again, this is because the network structure, each of these network structures has different persistent modes, and the rotation of the bump is most aligned with the persistent modes of the ring. So how does that help us to think differently about computation as a control problem? Well, the problem that we're facing is understanding the relationship between the network structure and the capacity for inputs to steer particular operations. What we can do is we can incorporate these methods from network control theory, examining simple operations around a fixed point, and then build, hopefully, a map of the relationship between network topologies and the potential for controlled computations. So the questions that we are pursuing here are, what kinds of computations is the brain built for? We have a network topology there that we can characterize very clearly now in the human. We can also do that in the fruit fly, in the mouse, in the macaque monkey, that has a structure that could support some computations more than others. Well, which computations are they that could be best supported by that sort of topology? But also, we're interested not just in the entire structure of the brain and what computations it can support, but we're interested in simple subcircuits inside of the brain. Let's say we just focused on connectivity in the visual cortex. What are the sorts of computations that can be easily supported by the network structure in the visual cortex? And then lastly, we're interested in asking, how do circuits develop over evolutionary timescales or over developmental timescales in the human that can support more than one type of computation with relatively low energy? And how would we design them in artificial systems? So that brings me to the end of the 3 sections that I wanted to communicate today, but I want to summarize where we've been. So we started by noting that the brain's structural network constrains the flow of activity, thereby influencing which trajectories are accessible to the system and which trajectories are more difficult for the system. Then we moved on to describing network control theory in a conceptual way and indicating that that theory models the constraint of the underlying network and provides an estimate for the energy that is required for certain brain state transitions. Then I showed you some data in humans that demonstrates that control energy tracks the information content of brain states, being higher for rarer states. The control energy is also larger when we transition into a more cognitively demanding task, and the control energy decreases with learning and habit formation. Lastly, in that short final section, I mentioned that the network constraint can help us to think differently about computations and what computations a given network can support with relatively low energy. And I think that could potentially inform how we think about designing artificial circuits as well. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening, and I'd love to take questions on this work.